Britain went to war twice, not for land, not for faith, to force another country to accept a commodity it had outlawed. Two full naval wars, treaties signed at gunpoint. And the reason, the actual reason, traces back to a habit so ordinary that right now, someone in your building is probably doing it. Making a cup of tea. That's not a metaphor. The history of tea is, at its core, the story of how a plant made the most powerful empire in the world, desperate enough to do things it could never quite explain away. And the consequences, the Opium Wars, one of history's most audacious acts of industrial espionage, the American Revolution, are still reshaping the world you live in. Worth saying up front, this video covers the history of colonial economic exploitation and the opium trade as documented history, not as anything to romanticize. Some dates and scholarly interpretations remain debated. All flag where the evidence gets uncertain. These are the facts of what happened. This is Object Origins, where we follow everyday objects back through history until the story gets uncomfortable. And this one gets uncomfortable fast. By the end of this, you'll never drink tea the same way again. Not because the tea changed, but because you'll know exactly what it cost. We'll follow the leaf from a Chinese imperial monopoly, through British desperation and dependency, all the way to a botanist dressed in disguise who pulled off one of the greatest thefts in trade history. And we'll land somewhere you probably didn't expect. For most of recorded history, tea existed in exactly one place on Earth: China. The Chinese had been cultivating and drinking tea for somewhere around 4,000 years before Britain even knew what it was. And for most of that time, China treated the knowledge of tea production, the plants, the seeds, the processing techniques, as a state-level secret. You could buy tea from China. You could not learn how it was made. The plant did not leave. By the 1600s, tea was reaching Europe through Dutch traders, and the British East India Company began importing it in quantity. It spread through British society with unusual speed, from the aristocracy downward, until by the early 1700s, it had become the defining national habit. Not wine, not coffee, tea. Twice a day, every day, across every class. Britain was now structurally dependent on a single foreign supplier that had no comparable need for anything Britain made. That asymmetry is where everything starts to go wrong. China accepted payment in silver, only silver. The Qing dynasty had no interest in British wool, British manufactured goods, or British goodwill. So silver flowed east, steadily, then heavily, draining British reserves in exchange for a leaf. By the late 1700s, the tea trade between Britain and China had produced one of the most lopsided trade deficits in the era. The East India Company was shipping an enormous volume of silver to Canton, with very little coming back the other way. The company needed a commodity, something China would actually buy. They found one in Bengal: opium. Opium grown in British-controlled India could be sold in China, and the proceeds used to buy tea. It was elegant as a financial instrument and devastating as a human one. Dependency spread through Chinese port cities. The Qing government banned the trade. Britain continued the practice regardless, through a combination of smugglers, private merchants, and deliberate institutional blindness. When China destroyed a large stockpile of British-held opium in 1839, Britain sent warships. The First Opium War lasted 3 years. The second, beginning in 1856, involved France as well. Both ended with China signing treaties that opened its ports, legalized the opium trade, and handed Hong Kong to Britain. The world's largest empire had fought and won 2 wars to protect a trade that the other side had explicitly rejected, all so the tea could keep coming. Here's the detail that doesn't get enough attention. Even as Britain was winning those wars, it was already trying to escape its dependence on China entirely. And the method it chose was a kind of espionage so brazen it would be remarkable even by modern standards. In 1848, a Scottish botanist named Robert Fortune was hired by the East India Company with a specific brief: travel into the Chinese interior, which was closed to foreigners, obtain live tea plants and seeds, recruit experienced tea workers, and bring the whole operation back to British India. Fortune disguised himself, learned enough Mandarin to move through rural areas, and spent 2 years doing exactly that. He shipped thousands of plants and seedlings to the Himalayas. He brought Chinese tea masters to Darjeeling and Assam to teach cultivation and processing. It worked. Within a generation, British India was producing tea at scale. The Assam and Darjeeling plantations grew into an industry that would eventually surpass China in global exports. The knowledge that China had protected for 4,000 years was now running at full production under British management. On land worked, it should be said clearly, under conditions of severe labor exploitation that defined the colonial plantation system. The tea trade had shifted. China's monopoly was broken not by negotiation, but by theft and force. The leaf Britain had bled for was now growing on British terms. But tea had already claimed something Britain hadn't planned to lose. Rewind to 1773. Before the Opium Wars, before Robert Fortune, before any of this, tea had already extracted one enormous price. The British government, trying to bail out the East India Company's finances, passed the Tea Act, which gave the company a monopoly on tea sales to the American colonies and allowed it to undercut local merchants. The colonists didn't object primarily to the price. The tea was actually cheaper. They objected to the principle that Parliament could regulate their commerce without their consent. In December 1773, colonists boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and threw 342 chests of East India Company tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party. Britain's response, punitive legislation the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, accelerated the push toward revolution. 3 years later, the United States declared independence. Tea didn't cause the American Revolution, but it was the specific object that crystallized the conflict. Britain's attempt to manage its tea trade created the incident that helped sever one of its most valuable colonial relationships. The leaf that had become essential to British identity had also become a symbol of exactly the kind of imperial overreach that was starting to cost empires more than they gained. Right now, the global tea industry is worth somewhere around $200 billion annually. Roughly 2 million tons of tea move through the world's supply chains every year. It's the second most consumed beverage on Earth, behind only water. And all of it, every plantation in Assam, every bag in your kitchen, every afternoon ritual in every country that drinks it, traces back through this exact chain. A Chinese monopoly that lasted millennia, a British dependency that created a silver crisis, a decision to fund the habit with opium, 2 wars fought to keep the supply flowing, and 1 botanist in disguise carrying seeds through the mountains. The history of tea is the history of how far a civilization will go when it becomes dependent on something it can't produce. The answer, as it turns out, is very far, further than it can justify afterward. Worth keeping in mind as you consider how we frame peaceful trade and civilizing commerce as historical concepts. The documented record is more complicated than the language suggests. The most ordinary ritual in the world was built on some of the least ordinary decisions in history. That doesn't make the tea taste different, but it might make you think differently about what ordinary things are actually made of. As with all our episodes, this is history and interpretation based on mainstream, scholarly consensus. Dates, figures, and attributions reflect the best available evidence, but historical understanding is always evolving. If that's the kind of history you want to sit with, subscribe. I put out videos like this regularly, following everyday objects back to the places the story gets strange. A like helps more people find it, and I think some of them need to know this one. There's more on the channel that picks up where this leaves off.